Here we have a case of murder and cannibalism on the high seas. It's called the Queen versus Dudley and Stevens, and it's one of the most studied cases in all of crim law. This is the legal question before the court. Was this murder justified by necessity? Now, first you notice that nobody questions whether this was murder. The only question is whether this murder was justified by necessity. So really we need to examine just what kind of necessities exist that could possibly justify murder, and whether the facts of our case amount to that kind of necessity. Now, ultimately, the court decides that the answer is no. They find the defendants guilty, sentence them to death. But let's take a look at how they got there. So this whole thing started when this rich dude down in Australia decided to buy a boat called a mignonette from England, of all places. And it's the late 1800s, so how do you get a boat from England to Australia? Well, it's a boat, so you sail it, obviously. So our rich guy hires a crew, and they sail the boat down the Atlantic along the coast of Africa, and everything's going fine until right around here when disaster strikes. The mignonette is lost, and the crew of 4 jump onto a lifeboat. And our crew consists of Dudley, who's a captain, his first mate Stevens, Brooks, who's a sailor, and a cabin boy about 17 or 18 named Parker. Now, Dudley and Stevens are the defendants. Parker is their victim. Now, these guys had to jump in the lifeboat pretty quick, and as a result, they didn't have time to grab the supplies they needed. So all they managed to bring was 2 tins of turnips. And a couple days later, they caught a sea turtle, no fresh water at all. So by the time day 19 rolls around, they are just dying of mostly thirst, hunger and thirst, but mostly thirst. Various states, of course. Parker being the worst because, foolish boy, he drank some seawater. I mean, like, you just gotta watch one episode of Bear Grylls, and, like, apparently these guys did, because they knew to drink their own urine before drinking seawater. So Parker's, like, foaming at the mouth. Or actually, he's not really foaming in the mouth. I made that fact up, which I shouldn't do. But you get the point. He's certainly unwell. And it's at this point that Dudley, our captain, suggests that, hey, you know what we should do, guys, is we should draw lots. 1 short stick, 3 long sticks, and whoever gets a short stick has to sacrifice himself so that the other 3 can drink his sacrificial blood and live a couple more days. No salvation's in sight, so it's not a great idea. And Brooks is like, this is not a great idea. I'm not doing it. So Dudley's like, okay, well then, why don't we just kill this boy? Look at him. He looks like he's about to die anyway. Might as well kill him now while his blood is fresh and delicious. I got to get home to my family. Steven's got to get home to his family. Brooks is like, no. Definitely not okay. So this issue is unresolved. And Dudley says, let's just wait a day until day 20 the next day. If no boat comes to save us, I'm going to do it. So day 20 rolls around, no ship comes to save them. Dudley tells Brooks, hey, you look like you could take a nap. And Brooks is like, yep, okay, I'm going to go take a nap. I mean, come on, Brooks probably knew what was going to happen. But anyway, so he's taking a nap. Dudley has Stevens hold the Parker boy down. He pulls out his penknife and stabs Parker in the jugular. Parker dies, and the 3 men proceed to commit cannibalism. And a few more days pass, they are picked up by a ship and brought back to England for trial. Returning now to the legal question, before we get into legal analysis, first understand that the court has already deemed this murder. So what does that mean? Well, it just means that we have this label called murder, this legal label called murder, that we slap onto a collection of events. So, what are the members in this set of things? Well, here's, for example, when Brutus stabbed Caesar. Right, here's, for example, when Walter White ran over those 2 guys with his SUV to save Jesse's life. Here's when Anakin went apeshit and decided to kill all those Padawans, where maybe that's a couple of dots, right? Here's every other scene from Game of Thrones, right? So that's really all we mean when we say something is murder. So for any new event, any new case that goes up before the court, right? This dot represents the facts of the case. And really the court's job is to decide whether this dot, the facts of the case, this case, whether it goes into this set which is said to be murder, or it falls outside the set, which is said to be not murder. Right, so that's it. That's what we're doing here. And of course, you'll notice that the boundary is fuzzy because, of course, it's fuzzy. There are all these cases which is just not clear whether it goes in or out, and it's always those fuzzy cases that you'll be dealing with because it's the fuzzy cases that ultimately determine where the boundary lies, whether it pushes the boundary out or it brings the boundary in. And in our case, the court's already decided that Dudley's and Stevens Act does in fact constitute murder, so it's well within the set. Having established that, now we get to look at this bit about justified by necessity. What does that mean, justified by necessity? How do you want to conceptualize it? Well, using the same framework, a subset called excuse/justification. These are the events which, they are murder. Now you can see that they're well within the murder set, but for one reason or another, they're excused or justified. Right? The normal legal consequences that carry with murder don't apply to these special cases. Later on in criminal law, we'll learn about the different excuses and justifications, but for now, we just need to deal with this notion of necessity, which we know is one type of justification, right? So now the question becomes, for our case, while we know it falls within this large set, does it fall within this small set? Right? In other words, is it excused or justified? If it is excused or justified, it's right here. If it's not excused or justified, it's right here. Right? So that's what the court's deciding. So now we have the conceptual framework. Let's take a look at the legal analysis. The court begins its legal analysis by invoking Lord Hale, and with Lord Hale, what we get a positive example of something that does in fact constitute necessity, which then does justify murder, and this thing is called self-defense. I know we're all very familiar with self-defense. This dude's got a gun, he's holding the gun up to you and he's gonna shoot you, but let's say you have a knife and somehow you manage to stab this your assailant to death. So and we distill all of that into a little dot. Of course, this dot, while it's murder, it would go within this subset. It would be something that's excused justified. The court presents us with this situation to show us how unlike our case this situation is. This is the guy that killed somebody. This is the guy that died, right? So how do we analogize? So this is what, Dudley, right? The guy that killed somebody. So the guy that died is what, Parker? But this guy was threatening to kill you. Parker was in no way threatening Dudley or Stevens. Parker was passed out, right? So this analogy, if this analogy were to work, then okay, great, then they get off scot-free, right? Their excuse justified, but this analogy doesn't work. So now the court goes on to say, look, Lord Hale gives us another example which actually very closely matches what happened here. So in this new example, you still got this guy with a gun. He's saying, I'm going to shoot you, and you have the knife, unless you go stab this innocent person over here and kill this innocent person. And you see how this is very analogous to what happened on the boat, right? This person who's having to make the decision, do I kill this innocent person? That's Dudley and Stevens. This innocent person, that's Parker. Right, so who's this guy? Who's this guy putting a lot of duress, putting a lot of pressure on you to kill this person at the risk of forfeiture of your own life? Well, that's the environment. That's the situation they're in. They're in a lifeboat, they haven't eaten, they're dying of thirst. So if you don't kill this person is going to shoot you. If you don't kill Parker, the environment is going to kill you via thirst. Right, so the analogy is very closely established. Okay, so then what happens here? What does Lord Hale say about this person's decision? Lord Hale says you cannot kill this innocent person. In other words, if you do kill this innocent person, like Dudley has done, you are outside the excuse subset. You are just in the murder set. And why? Well, Hale says, for he referring to this dude, he ought rather to die himself than to kill an innocent. So that's the argument for self-defense, but Lord Hale's not done yet. He sticks around and makes another argument, this one centered around larceny or theft. So maybe thinking, what does larceny or theft have anything to do with murder? Well, conceptually, you can think of it the same way. Larceny has its own set of excuses and justifications. Now consider the two crimes side by side. Which crime is worse? Of course, murder is worse, right? It's murder. This one's theft. I mean, it's not a great thing, but relatively speaking, it's better than murder. Okay, what does that have to say about the excuse or justification of each? Right? In other words, which crime needs a stronger excuse or justification? Well, of course, the worst one needs a stronger excuse or justification. Whatever your excuse or justification is that gets you off the hook for larceny, for theft, may or may not get you off the hook for murder because murder's way worse. So it follows then logically that if the excuse or justification you have does not get you off the hook for larceny, in other words, if it's too weak to save you from larceny, then certainly it's too weak to save you from a stronger charge of murder. I'll say that again. Whatever excuse or justification you have, if it's too weak to save you from larceny, it's certainly too weak to save you from murder because you need a stronger justification. Right? So what is the justification here? It's the necessity for food or water. And Lord Hale says, in England, your necessity for food or water does not save you from stealing food or water. If you're dying of thirst or hunger, you steal something, that's a felony, you're put to death. So in our case, what could Dudley and Stevens' excuse or justification possibly be other than necessity for food or water? Of course, that's all it is. And if this excuse or justification is too weak to save them from even larceny, if they stole bread from Parker, they would still be found guilty of felony and put to death, then certainly it wouldn't excuse them from killing Parker. So that's the second argument the court makes. So now our court looks across the Atlantic to America to this case called Holmes, where sailors on an overcapacity lifeboat threw some passengers overboard so that they could live. And the American court said, nope, that's not okay. And our English court says, see, look, they rule the same way. This is not okay. So the third argument in support of their position. Interestingly, the court does make a comment about the rationale. The American court's rationale was that, hey, you guys should have drawn lots. If there just were too many people, draw lots to determine who has to go overboard. And the English court called that rationale strange. So I don't know. Do you think it's strange? That was Dudley's first proposal. So now our court turns to Lord Bacon, another jurist, who says, look, the necessity of conservation of life carrieth a privilege. And what he's saying is basically exactly the opposite of what Hale is saying, right? If you are dying of hunger or thirst, you steal bread, guess what? That's okay. You are in here. It is excused, justified. He says if you are a drowned sailor and there's a floating plank and you get yourself onto the plank and you push off another sailor who was holding onto the plank, and as a result, this guy dies, you don't need to invoke accident or self-defense. Your act is just justified. Right? You would just be in here. It's justified. So see, he's just saying it's exactly the opposite of what Hale said. So how does our court deal with it? Well, our court just calls it dictum and ignores it. Right? Dictum here is to be distinguished, in law, dictum to be distinguished from the holding. While both are authoritative, the holding is binding on subsequent decisions. Dictum is not. It's just an authority. And the court says, look, there are other principles, other superior authorities to that of Bacon. So we're free to ignore this. It is not the law of the land. So now we come to the court's final argument, which is an appeal to morality. So first, the court tells us that if the temptation to murder in this case is held up to be a defense, then there will be an absolute divorce of law from morality. Now, the court does remind us, look, the temptation was great. The suffering was terrible. But nevertheless, if the temptation is held up to be a defense, then there will be an absolute divorce of law from morality. The court goes on to say the absolute divorce of law from morality has fatal consequences. And here we assume things which have fatal consequences we don't want, right? So therefore we conclude it's not the case that temptation to murder is a defense, right? So here they're running the contrapositive argument structure, and you thought that LSAT wouldn't be helpful, right? So divorce of law from morality has fatal consequences, therefore don't do it. Don't divorce law from morality, therefore fold the contrapositive back. Temptation to murder is not a defense. So that's the argument structure. Now the court spends a lot of time trying to persuade us of this first premise. Why should we believe this premise? That if the temptation to murder excused them from murder, then there will be a divorce of law from morality. What morality? Well, the court says two sources of morality: our pagan ethics and our Christian ethics. The court names Romans and Greeks, Cicero and Euripides, and of course Christ, the great example. And our moral heritage, the court says, speaks of a duty to sacrifice. To sacrifice your life. Now, Dudley and Stevens will say, look, we have a duty to preserve our lives. And of course, these two duties are contradictory. But the court says this duty supersedes. Look at war, for example. War is full of instances where it's a man's duty to die, not to live. Or more on point, a shipwreck. A captain has a duty to his crew. A crew has a duty to the passengers. So in our case, why was it any more necessary that Dudley kill Parker than that Dudley sacrifice his own life, fulfilling his moral obligation as captain so that the other three could live? So do you see how if you allow temptation to be an excuse, a justification for murder, then the law will be divorced from what morality demands? So there you have it. This murder was not justified by necessity.